Some chains are forged not from metal, but from the promises we make to ghosts who no longer deserve our loyalty. For 3 long winters, Brynja had worn the silver torc that bound her to a dead man's cruel memory. In the great hall of Vargstead, where warriors gathered around roaring fires and spoke of battles won and lost, she had become invisible, a widow marked as untouchable by the heavy chain around her neck. The torc was both her protection and her prison, placed there by a husband who had taken her by force rather than love. Then Ulfarr One-Eye returned from exile. The giant warrior bore scars from distant lands and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that true strength sometimes meant knowing when not to fight. When Brynja whispered her desperate plea to him in the flickering firelight, she asked for something no blade could accomplish: freedom from the weight of the past. But would this battle-hardened warrior understand that what she needed wasn't conquest, but the gentle courage to help her reclaim herself? Before we continue this tale of honor and healing, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Vargstead had witnessed countless seasons of joy and sorrow, its timber walls darkened by decades of hearth smoke and human stories. Tonight, as autumn's final breath gave way to winter's first whisper, the familiar crackle of burning pine logs filled the air with warmth that seemed to mock the coldness that had settled in Brynja's heart. She sat in her customary place near the eastern wall, where the shadows fell deepest and conversations flowed around her like water around a stone. The silver torc caught the firelight with each breath she took, its weight as familiar now as her own heartbeat. 3 winters it had adorned her throat, 3 winters since Gunnar Ironside had breathed his last, leaving behind a legacy of fear and a wife who had never truly been his. The hall buzzed with the evening's activities. Young warriors boasted of their hunting prowess, while their elders nodded with patient wisdom, having heard such tales 1,000 times before. Women moved between the long tables, their voices a gentle counterpoint to the deeper rumble of masculine conversation. Children darted between legs and benches, their laughter a bright thread woven through the tapestry of community life. Brynja watched it all with the detached observation of someone who had learned to live within her own invisible walls. The morning torc had become more than jewelry. It was a statement written in silver across her throat, declaring to all who looked upon her that she belonged to memory, not to the living world. You sit too often in shadows, daughter of my heart. The voice belonged to Astrid Whitehair, the hall's eldest woman and its unofficial keeper of wisdom. The old woman lowered herself onto the bench beside Brynja with the careful movements of someone whose bones had earned their aches through 8 decades of Nordic winters. "The shadows are honest," Brynja replied, her fingers unconsciously touching the torc. "They ask nothing of me." Astrid's weathered hands found Brynja's, stilling the nervous gesture. "And they give you nothing in return. A fair trade, perhaps, but not a living one." Around them, the hall continued its ancient rhythm. Bjorn the Skald had begun one of his stories, his voice rising and falling with practiced cadence as he wove tales of distant lands and heroic deeds. The listeners leaned forward, drawn into his words like moths to flame. Even the children had settled, their young faces solemn with concentration. "Tell me," Astrid continued, her voice low enough to remain private in the public space, "what do you see when you look upon this hall?" Brynja considered the question, her gaze sweeping across the familiar scene. "I see people living their lives, making their choices, moving forward. And yourself? Where do you fit in this living picture?" The question hung between them like smoke from the hearth, visible but untouchable. Brynja knew the answer, had known it for 3 years, but speaking it aloud felt like admitting defeat. "I don't," she whispered. "I exist beside it, watching it, but not part of it." Astrid nodded slowly, as if this confession confirmed something she had long suspected. "The torc speaks louder than your voice, child. It tells a story you may no longer wish to tell." Before Brynja could respond, a commotion near the hall's great doors drew their attention. The massive oak panels, reinforced with iron and carved with protective runes, swung open to admit a figure that seemed to bring the winter wind with him. Conversations faltered and died as every eye turned toward the entrance. Ulfarr One-Eye stood in the doorway like a statue carved from mountain stone and shadow. His presence filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with his considerable size, though he was indeed a giant among men, standing head and shoulders above even the tallest warriors in the hall. It was the stillness about him that commanded attention, the sense that here was a man who had seen enough of the world's violence to choose his battles with careful precision. His single eye, the left, had been taken years ago in a battle whose details had become legend, swept the hall with the methodical assessment of a seasoned warrior. But there was no threat in his gaze, no challenge. Instead, there was something that spoke of hard-won wisdom and the kind of strength that came not from the ability to break things, but from the discipline to protect them. "Ulfarr Grimson," Bjorn the Skald called out, his storyteller's voice carrying easily across the now silent hall. "You honor us with your return." The giant warrior inclined his head in acknowledgement, but did not immediately speak. His gaze had found Brynja across the crowd, and for a moment that stretched like held breath, their eyes met. In that brief connection, she saw something that made her heart flutter against her ribs like a trapped bird. Not desire, not conquest, but recognition. As if he looked upon her and saw not the mourning widow, not the untouchable woman marked by silver chains, but simply Brynja, the person she had been before Gunnar, before the torc, before 3 years of voluntary exile from her own life. "I thank you for your welcome," Ulfarr said finally, his voice carrying the depth of distant thunder. "I have traveled far and seen much, but nothing compares to the warmth of home fires and familiar faces." The tension in the hall eased as normal conversation gradually resumed. Warriors approached Ulfarr with genuine warmth, for though he had been gone these many years, he was remembered as a man of honor. They pressed him for tales of his travels, offered him ale and food, made space for him at their table. But even as he engaged with old friends and accepted their hospitality, Brynja noticed that his attention periodically returned to her. Not with the obvious staring that would have drawn comment, but with the subtle awareness of someone who had marked something or someone worthy of deeper consideration. "He watches you," Astrid observed quietly. "Many watch me," Brynja replied, though her pulse quickened. "The torc draws eyes." "Not the torc, child. You. There is a difference." As if to prove the old woman's point, Ulfarr excused himself from his companions and began making his way across the hall. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural fighter, but there was nothing predatory in his approach. Instead, he carried himself with the careful respect of someone approaching something precious that might startle if handled roughly. Other conversations continued around them, but Brynja felt as if the entire hall had faded to background whispers. Her breathing became shallow, her hands instinctively smoothing the fabric of her woolen dress. When had she last been approached by a man? When had she last wanted to be? "Lady Brynja," Ulfarr said as he reached their table, his voice gentler than she would have expected from such an imposing figure. "I hope you will forgive my boldness in approaching without formal introduction. I am Ulfarr Grimson, son of Grim the Bold." "I know who you are," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Your reputation preceded your exile and has grown in your absence." A shadow crossed his features at the mention of his exile, but it passed quickly. "Reputations are often larger than the men they describe. I prefer to let my actions speak. And what do your actions say?" The question came from some bold part of herself that she had thought long dead, that I am a man who has learned the difference between strength and violence, between taking and earning. His eye found the torc at her throat, but unlike other men who stared at it with fear or calculation, his gaze held only quiet understanding, that some treasures are worth any price except the cost of another's freedom. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were exactly what her heart had been waiting 3 years to hear. Here was a man who understood that her value lay not in her position or her possessions, but in her right to choose her own path. "Your travels have taught you wisdom," Astrid interjected, her voice warm with approval. "Sit, warrior. Share your tales with an old woman who has seen enough winters to appreciate a good story." Ulfarr accepted the invitation, settling onto the bench across from them with movements that spoke of old injuries carefully managed. Up close, Brynja could see the network of scars that mapped his visible skin, some clean and precise, others ragged and telling of desperate fights. But it was his hands that drew her attention. They were large enough to crush stone, yet when he reached for his ale cup, he handled it with the gentle precision of someone accustomed to holding fragile things. "What would you hear, grandmother?" he asked Astrid, though his eye remained aware of Brynja's presence. "Tell us of the lands beyond our borders. Tell us what you have learned in your wandering." Ulfarr considered this, taking a slow sip of his ale before responding. "I have learned that strength without purpose becomes cruelty, that honor without compassion becomes pride, and that home is not a place but a state of belonging. And have you found such belonging in your travels?" Brynja found herself asking. "I have found pieces of it," he replied carefully, "but the whole remains elusive. Perhaps because I was looking in the wrong places." The conversation continued as the evening progressed, but it was unlike any exchange Brynja had experienced since donning the morning torch. Ulfarr spoke to her as an equal, asking her opinions on matters of community and judgment, listening to her responses with the attention he might give to a valued advisor. He told stories of distant lands and foreign customs, but always in a way that invited her thoughts, rather than simply seeking to impress. As the hall gradually emptied and the fire burned lower, Brynja realized that for the first time in 3 years, she had forgotten to be invisible. She had laughed at Ulfar's dry observations about the peculiarities of southern customs, had challenged his assessment of trade routes, had even found herself arguing with passionate conviction about the proper way to preserve knowledge through the winter months. "I should retire," she said finally, as the last of the evening's revelers made their way to their sleeping quarters. "The morning brings its own duties." "As should I," Ulfarr agreed, rising as she did. "But I hope," he paused, seemed to choose his words with care, "I hope this will not be our only conversation during my stay." "That depends," Brynja replied, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the torc. "How long do you plan to remain in Vargstead?" "I had not decided. I have no pressing obligations elsewhere." His expression grew serious. "But I find myself hoping that something here might prove worth staying for." The weight of his words settled between them like a tangible thing. Brynja felt her heart racing, felt the stirring of something she had thought permanently buried beneath duty and sorrow. "Good night." "Ulfarr Grimson," she said, not trusting herself to say more. "Good night, Lady Brynja. May your dreams be peaceful." As she walked toward her private quarters, Brynja could feel the weight of the torc against her throat more acutely than she had in months. But for the first time since Gunnar's death, that weight felt less like security and more like a burden she might, someday, perhaps, be ready to set aside. 3 days passed before the moment that would change everything arrived. Carried on the bitter wind of an early winter storm, Brynja had found herself looking forward to the evening gatherings in the great hall with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Each night, Ulfarr would seek her out, not with the obvious pursuit of a man hunting conquest, but with the patient interest of someone discovering a kindred spirit. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of governance and trade to deeper questions of purpose and meaning that left her feeling more alive than she had since before her marriage. Tonight, however, the hall felt different. The storm that had been threatening for days had finally arrived, sending icy fingers through every crack and crevice in the ancient timbers. Warriors huddled closer to the fire, and even the heartiest souls seemed subdued by the howling wind that rattled the great doors like an unwelcome visitor demanding entry. Brynja sat in her usual place, but her attention kept drifting to the entrance. Ulfarr had been absent since morning, having joined a hunting party that had departed before dawn. The other men had returned hours ago, their faces grim with the news that the storm had struck earlier than expected, separating them from their companion somewhere in the treacherous forest paths. "He knows these lands," Bjorn the Skald had assured the worried gathering. "Ulfarr has survived worse than a winter storm. He'll find shelter and return when it passes." But as the evening stretched on and the wind grew more vicious, Brynja found herself unable to focus on anything except the empty space where Ulfarr usually sat. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Somewhere in the past 3 days, this man had become important to her, not as a rescuer or a replacement for what she had lost, but as something entirely new, something she had never experienced with Gunnar, who had claimed her as property rather than choosing her as a partner. "You wear worry like a cloak tonight," Astrid observed, settling beside her with 2 cups of warm ale, spiced with herbs. "The storm troubles me," Brynja replied, accepting the drink gratefully. The storm or the man caught in it? Before Brynja could formulate an answer, the great doors burst open with such force that they struck the walls with a thunderous boom. Snow and wind swirled into the hall like attacking spirits, extinguishing several torches and sending everyone scrambling to protect the main fire. Through the chaos stepped Ulfarr, but not the composed warrior who had left that morning. His cloak hung in tatters. His hair was matted with ice, and blood from numerous cuts painted dark streaks across his exposed skin. He moved with the careful precision of someone fighting exhaustion with pure will. Each step calculated to keep him upright just a little longer. The hall erupted into activity as people rushed to help him, pressing food and warm drinks into his hands, offering dry clothes and a place by the fire. But Ulfar's eyes searched the crowd until it found Brynja, and in that gaze she saw something that made her breath catch, relief so profound it bordered on desperation, as if the thought of not seeing her again had been what truly frightened him in the storm. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind, but carrying clearly across the concerned voices of their community. Privately, the request sent murmurs through the gathering. It was unusual for a warrior to seek private audience with a mourning widow, especially one wearing the torc of untouchability. But there was something in Ulfar's manner, an urgency that went beyond mere social convention, that made even the most traditional voices hold their tongues. The small chamber behind the hearth, Astrid suggested, her eyes bright with understanding. "It will be warm and quiet." Brynja rose on unsteady legs, her heart hammering against her ribs as she led Ulfarr to the alcove that served as a private meeting space for the hall's most sensitive conversations. The chamber was small, lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the timber walls. A simple bench and a low table comprised the only furniture, but the space felt intimate rather than sparse. Ulfarr closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment, his massive frame suddenly looking vulnerable in the lamplight. When he turned to face her, Brynja saw something in his expression that made her forget to breathe. A man who had stared into the face of his own mortality and realized what mattered most. "I thought I might die out there," he said simply. No dramatics or embellishment, just the stark honesty of someone who had wrestled with truth and emerged victorious. "Lost in the storm, bleeding from a dozen cuts where the ice-laden branches caught me. I found myself thinking not of the battles I'd won or the places I'd seen, but of conversations unfinished and words unspoken. Ulfarr, let me say this," he interrupted gently, stepping closer but still maintaining respectful distance. "I have lived as a warrior for 37 winters. I have taken what I wanted through strength, defended what I valued through violence, and measured my worth by the fear I could inspire in other men. But sitting here these past 3 days, speaking with you, I have learned that there is a different kind of strength, one that builds rather than destroys, that protects rather than conquers." His eye found the torc at her throat, and his expression grew soft with understanding. I see how that chain binds you, not just to the memory of your husband, but to a life half-lived. I see how you watch the world from shadows, participating without truly engaging, existing without truly living. It is my choice to honor. No, the word was spoken quietly, but with absolute conviction. It is your prison disguised as duty, and I hope, that you are as tired of it as I am of watching you diminish yourself. Brynja felt tears she hadn't shed in months burning behind her eyes. What are you asking of me? I am asking. He paused, seemed to gather courage from some deep well within himself. I'm asking if you would let me remove that torc, not as conquest, not as claiming, but as liberation. As one person helping another step from shadow into light. The request hung between them like a bridge over an abyss, terrifying in its implications, impossible to ignore once spoken. Brynja's hand rose instinctively to the silver chain, her fingers tracing its familiar weight. You don't understand what you're asking, she whispered. This torc is more than jewelry. It's protection. It declares that I belong to no man, that I am beyond reach of their ambitions and desires. And what if I told you that I have no desire to own you? What if I told you that what I offer is partnership, not possession? That I see in you not a prize to be won, but a woman worthy of choice, her own choice. His words struck her like arrows finding their mark, each one piercing the careful armor she had built around her heart. This was what she had dreamed of during the long years of her marriage to Gunnar. A man who would see her as an equal rather than property, who would offer respect rather than demand submission. I don't know if I remember how to choose, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Then let this be your first choice, Ulfarr said, extending his hand palm up in invitation rather than demand. Let me help you remember what freedom feels like. For a long moment that stretched like held breath, Brynja stared at his outstretched hand. She could hear the storm raging outside, could feel the weight of 3 years' worth of carefully constructed safety pressing down upon her shoulders. But she could also hear something else, the quiet voice of her own heart, speaking for the first time in years. Remove it, she whispered, the words barely audible even in the small chamber. Then stronger, with the conviction of someone finally choosing her own path. Please, remove it. Ulfar's eye widened slightly, as if he hadn't quite believed she would accept his offer. Are you certain? Once it's gone, there will be no protection from those who might seek to court you, no barrier between you and the world's expectations. Then I will face those challenges as a free woman, Brynja replied, lifting her chin with determination she hadn't felt in years. I will make my own choices about who deserves my attention and who does not. Starting with this choice, right now. With infinite care, Ulfarr stepped closer, his large hands reaching for the clasp of the torc, with the gentleness of someone handling precious glass. This may feel strange at first, he warned softly. You've worn this weight for so long that its absence might feel like floating. I'm ready, she said, though her heart raced with fear and anticipation in equal measure. As his fingers worked at the intricate clasp, Brynja closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for transformation. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when the silver chain finally gave way, sliding from her throat like a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten what it meant to stand straight. The torc fell into Ulfar's waiting hands with a soft clink that seemed to echo through the chamber like the sound of breaking chains. And for the first time in 3 years, Brynja breathed deeply, her lungs filling with air that tasted of possibility. The morning after the torc's removal brought an awareness so sharp it felt like walking into sunlight after years in a cave. Brynja stood before the polished bronze mirror in her quarters, her fingers repeatedly rising to touch the bare skin of her throat where the silver chain had rested for 3 long winters. The absence felt profound. Not just the physical weight she had grown accustomed to, but something deeper. For the first time since Gunnar's death, she looked like herself rather than a monument to someone else's memory. The woman reflected in the bronze surface had color in her, cheeks and brightness in her eyes that had been missing so long she had forgotten they belonged to her. But With freedom came uncertainty that gnawed at her stomach like hunger. What did a free woman do? How did she move through the world without the protective barrier that had kept unwanted attention at bay? The torc had been prison and shield both, and now she stood exposed to possibilities she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. A soft knock at her door interrupted her anxious thoughts. "Come!" she called, smoothing her woolen dress and trying to arrange her expression into something approaching composed. "Good morning, daughter of my heart." Astrid entered carrying a tray laden with fresh bread, cheese, and steaming herbal tea. But it was the small wooden box tucked under her arm that drew Brynja's attention. "You didn't need to bring breakfast, grandmother." "I could have." "Nonsense. A woman who has just reclaimed her life deserves to be cared for, at least for one morning." Astrid set the tray on the room's simple table and turned to study Brynja with eyes that missed nothing. "You look different. Lighter, as if some burden has been lifted." "It feels strange," Brynja admitted, her hand rising once again to her bare throat. "Like I've forgotten how to be myself." "That is because you have, in a way." Astrid settled onto the room's single chair, the wooden box resting in her lap. 3 years is a long time to live as someone else's echo. It will take time to remember who Brynja truly is, beneath all that careful duty. The old woman opened the box, revealing a collection of items that made Brynja's breath catch. Inside lay the jewelry she had worn before her marriage. Simple but beautiful pieces her mother had given her, crafted by skilled hands from silver and amber. She had put them away when Gunnar placed the mourning torc around her neck, unable to bear wearing anything that reminded her of the woman she had been. "I thought you might want these back," Astrid said gently. "A woman should have choices about how she adorns herself." Brynja reached for a pendant shaped like a small tree, its amber leaves catching the morning light that streamed through her window. She remembered her mother fastening it around her neck on the day she had become a woman grown. Remembered the pride in those familiar eyes as she spoke of strength that bent but did not break. "I had forgotten how beautiful these were," she whispered, lifting the pendant to catch more light. Beauty is easier to appreciate when it comes from choice rather than obligation. Astrid's voice carried the weight of experience. "That young warrior who helped you find your courage, he understands this distinction, Ulfarr." Even speaking his name brought warmth to her cheeks. "I wonder if he regrets what he offered last night. In daylight, it might seem less like heroism and more like interference. Would you like to find out?" Astrid's eyes twinkled with mischief. "I happen to know he has been awake since before dawn, working in the weapons practice yard. It seems he too found sleep elusive after last night's events." The idea of seeking him out sent nervous energy racing through Brynja's veins. Without the torc, approaching a man would mean something entirely different. She would no longer be the untouchable widow making conversation, but a free woman whose attentions might be interpreted as interest, perhaps because they would be. "I should thank him," she said, fastening the amber pendant around her throat. The familiar weight felt entirely different from the torc, light instead of heavy, chosen instead of imposed. It would be rude not to acknowledge what he did. Indeed, Astrid smiled, clearly recognizing the excuse for what it was. Gratitude is always appropriate. The practice yard lay behind the great hall, a wide space cleared of snow and marked with posts for weapons training. Brynja could hear the rhythmic sound of steel meeting wood long before she saw its source. A steady percussion that spoke of discipline and focused energy. Ulfarr moved through his forms with the fluid grace of someone who had turned violence into art through decades of practice. His massive frame should have made him clumsy, but instead he wielded his sword like an extension of his will, each movement precise and controlled. Sweat gleamed on his skin despite the cold morning air, and his breathing came in controlled puffs that dissipated like small clouds in the winter air. He was, Brynja realized with a flutter of awareness, magnificent. Not in the brutal way that Gunnar had been magnificent, all rage and intimidation, but in the way of a man who had learned to control his strength and direct it toward worthy purposes. He noticed her watching and brought his practice to a graceful close. driving his blade into the wooden post with a final, decisive strike. When he turned to face her, she saw the same uncertainty in his expression that she felt in her own heart. "Good morning, Lady Brynja." His voice carried formal politeness, but his eye searched her face as if looking for some sign of how she felt about their shared decision. "Just Brynja," she said, stepping closer to the practice area. "I think last night earned us the right to dispense with titles." Relief flickered across his features, followed quickly by something that might have been hope. "How do you feel?" He gestured vaguely toward her throat, where the amber pendant now rested instead of silver chain. "Terrified," she admitted, with an honesty that surprised them both. "Free but terrified. As if I've forgotten how to walk and must learn again from the beginning." "Freedom is frightening," Ulfarr agreed, pulling a cloth from his belt to wipe the sweat from his face and hands. "When I left Vargstead years ago, I thought I wanted nothing more than to be free of all obligations and expectations. But I learned that freedom without purpose is just another kind of prison. And have you found your purpose?" "I thought I had. I believed it lay in becoming the finest warrior I could be, in winning glory through strength and skill." He sheathed his sword with practiced ease. "But these past few days, speaking with you, I begin to think I was looking in the wrong direction entirely." His words sent warmth spreading through her chest, but also brought fresh anxiety. "Ulfarr, I need you to understand something. What happened last night, the torc, my choice to remove it, it doesn't mean I know what comes next. I don't know how to be courted or pursued. I don't even know if that's what I want." "Then let me tell you what I want," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I want to earn your trust through my actions, not claim it through assumption. I want to learn who you are when you're free to be yourself. And I want to share with you who I am when I'm not trying to prove my worth through violence." He paused, seemed to choose his next words with careful consideration. "I want to court your mind before your heart, to win your respect before your affection. And I want you to feel free to tell me no at any point if you decide I'm not worthy of either." The honesty in his words made her feel dizzy with possibility. This was what she had dreamed of during the long years of her marriage. A man who saw courtship as invitation rather than siege, who understood that true partnership required choice from both sides. "That sounds," she said carefully, "like something I might be willing to explore slowly." "Slowly," he agreed, and the smile that crossed his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "We have nothing but time, and I have learned patience in my travels." As they stood there in the practice yard, surrounded by the evidence of his disciplined strength, Brynja felt something shifting inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but the recognition that love might someday be possible. For the first time in 3 years, she was curious about her own future. The next week brought a rhythm that felt both foreign and wonderful, the rhythm of choice. Each morning, Brynja woke to decisions that had not existed in her carefully controlled morning period. What to wear, where to sit in the great hall, which conversations to join. Small freedoms that would have seemed insignificant to someone who had never lost them, but felt revolutionary to a woman reclaiming her right to self-determination. On this particular morning, she chose to visit the settlement's workshop, where the craftsmen plied their trades. The building hummed with productive energy as smiths shaped iron, carpenters fitted joints, and weavers worked their looms. But it was the corner where Einar the rune-carver sat that drew her attention. The old man looked up from the piece of walrus ivory he was etching, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Lady Brynja, it has been too long since you honored my workshop with a visit. Just Brynja, please." She had been gently correcting people all week, reclaiming even this small aspect of her identity. "I find myself in need of your skills, Einar." "Oh?" His eyes twinkled with curiosity as he set aside his tools. "What might I craft for a woman who has recently discovered her freedom?" The question brought heat to her cheeks, but she was learning to accept that her transformation was visible to anyone with eyes to see. "I want to commission a piece, something that speaks of new beginnings rather than endings." Einar nodded thoughtfully, his gnarled hands already reaching for fresh ivory and his finest tools. "And is this piece intended for yourself, or as a gift?" "For myself," she said firmly, then paused as another thought occurred. "But perhaps something that could be shared, if the right person proved worthy of sharing it with." Ah, the old craftsman's understanding smile suggested he was well aware of how she spent her evenings in conversation with a certain returned warrior. "I have just the thing in mind. But tell me, what symbols speak to your heart now that it beats freely again?" Brynja considered this, her fingers unconsciously playing with the amber pendant at her throat. "Something that grows, something that chooses to flourish despite harsh conditions. The mountain pine," Einar said immediately. "It bends with storms but does not break, sends roots deep into rocky soil, and offers shelter to creatures seeking refuge." He began sketching rough lines on a piece of bark. "And perhaps, yes, two pines growing close enough to share soil and strength, but each maintaining its own proud shape." The image he described resonated through her chest like a struck bell. "Yes, that captures it perfectly. It will take me several days to carve properly," Einar warned. "Good work cannot be rushed. I have learned patience recently. Take whatever time you need." As she left the workshop, Brynja's mind was already anticipating the finished piece. But her peaceful morning was interrupted by a commotion near the settlement's main gate. Raised voices carried across the common area, and she could see a small crowd gathering around what appeared to be visitors. Her steps slowed as she recognized one of the voices, Magnus Bloodaxe, Gunnar's younger brother, and a man who had made no secret of his disapproval when she chose to honor her husband's memory through extended mourning, rather than remarrying quickly to strengthen clan alliances. Disgraceful behavior from a woman who should know better, Magnus was saying as she approached the crowd. Gunnar barely cold in his grave, and already she parades around without the proper markings of respect. "Brother," the word came from Eric, Magnus's more level-headed sibling. "Perhaps this is not the place for such discussions. When is the proper place?" Magnus demanded, his voice carrying the heat of righteous anger. "When she has completely abandoned all pretense of honoring our family's memory. She wears baubles like a maiden instead of mourning jewelry, speaks freely with unmarried men, and acts as if her duties to the dead mean nothing." Brynja felt her hard-won confidence wavering as heads turned toward her. These were her neighbors, people she had lived alongside for years, and she could see the questions in their eyes. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, but a few wore expressions that suggested Magnus's words had found fertile ground. "Perhaps," said a calm voice that cut through the tension like a blade through silk, "the lady herself should be allowed to speak on her own behalf." Ulfarr had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the confrontation. He was not shouting or posturing, but his very stillness commanded attention in a way that bluster could not. "This does not concern you, exile," Magnus snapped, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Any conversation about Lady Brynja's choices concerns every man in this settlement who claims to value honor," Ulfarr replied evenly. "For what greater honor is there than allowing a woman to determine her own path once her obligations have been properly fulfilled?" "Her obligations," Magnus began, "were to mourn her husband for a proper period, which she did. 3 full winters of respect and remembrance." Ulfar's eyes swept the crowd, acknowledging each person individually. "Are we now to say that a woman may never again choose her own adornment? That she must carry grief like a chain around her neck until she dies?" "The morning talk is tradition," Eric said, but his voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. "Tradition serves the living," Astrid's voice interjected as the old woman pushed through the crowd to stand beside Brynja. "When tradition becomes a cage that prevents life from continuing, it has lost its purpose." Brynja felt strength returning to her spine as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, some hostile, some supportive, all watching to see how she would respond to this challenge to her newfound freedom. "I wore the morning talk for 3 years," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. 3 years of honoring a man who, whatever his faults, deserved to be remembered. But Gunnar is gone, and I am not. I choose to live as a woman, not as a monument to the dead. And what of family honor? Magnus demanded. What of the bonds that tie our clans together? What honor is there in forcing a woman to choose between respect for the dead and hope for the living? Brynja found herself speaking with a passion that surprised her. I have harmed no one by removing a chain. I've broken no vows by choosing to wear jewelry that was my mother's before it was anyone else's. If my freedom threatens your sense of order, perhaps the fault lies not with my choices, but with your understanding of what a woman's worth should be. The crowd had grown silent, absorbing the weight of her words. But it was Ulfar's slight nod of approval that gave her the courage to continue. I will not be made to apologize for choosing life over extended death. If that makes me unsuitable for your ideas of proper womanhood, then I accept that judgment gladly. Magnus's face had grown red with frustrated anger, but before he could respond, Eric placed a restraining hand on his brother's arm. Enough. This matter is settled. The lady has spoken her mind clearly, and any man who continues to harass her about her personal choices will answer to me. The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with the drama they had witnessed. Some cast disapproving glances in Brynja's direction, but others, particularly the younger women, looked at her with something that might have been admiration. You spoke well, Ulfarr said quietly, as the last of the observers drifted away. With conviction and dignity. I felt like my knees might give out, Brynja admitted, the adrenaline of confrontation leaving her slightly shaky. But I realized that if I didn't defend my own choices, I could hardly expect others to respect them. That is wisdom hard won, he agreed, and courage well displayed. As they walked together toward the great hall, Brynja found herself thinking about Einar's carved pines, 2 trees growing close enough to share strength, but maintaining their individual shapes. Perhaps that was what she was learning to do, how to be strong enough to stand alone while remaining open to the possibility of growing alongside someone who understood that true partnership required 2 complete people, not one person and half of another. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Magnus, winter settled over Vargstead with the finality of a closing door. The deep snows that arrived with the season brought both isolation and intimacy, forcing the community to draw closer together while cutting them off from the outside world. For Brynja, this enforced closeness meant that her growing relationship with Ulfarr could no longer remain a private matter whispered about in corners. She had begun to look forward to their evening conversations, with an anticipation that bordered on hunger. Each night they found new depths to explore in each other, not just the surface attractions that drew people together, but the underlying currents of philosophy and purpose that would determine whether their connection could weather life's inevitable storms. Tonight, however, something felt different. Ulfarr had been quieter than usual during the evening meal, his responses to her questions thoughtful but distant. When he suggested they take their conversation to the small chamber where he had first offered to remove her torc, she sensed that he had something weighing on his mind. The chamber felt smaller, with winter's presence pressing against the walls, but the oil lamp cast the same warm circle of light that had witnessed her first steps toward freedom. Ulfarr settled onto the bench across from her, but instead of his usual relaxed posture, he sat with the careful tension of someone preparing to confess something difficult. "There is something I need to tell you," he said without preamble. "Something about my exile, about the man I was before I learned to choose wisdom over pride." Brynja felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. "You don't owe me explanations about your past, but I do." His eye held hers with steady intensity. "Because the past has a way of arriving uninvited, and I would rather you hear truth from me than rumors from others." He reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a small object that caught the lamplight with metallic gleam. A silver arm ring, beautifully crafted, but bearing the unmistakable marks of violence. The metal was bent and scored, as if it had been torn from someone's arm by force. This belonged to a man named Thorkel the Wise, Ulfarr said, setting the damaged ring on the table between them. He was a jarl of some standing, known for his fair judgments and careful governance. 5 years ago, I killed him in single combat and took this as my prize. The words hit Brynja like physical blows. Not because she was shocked by the concept of violence, every warrior she had known carried blood on his hands, but because of the careful way Ulfarr spoke them, as if each word cost him something precious. Was it honorable combat? She asked, though something in his expression suggested the answer would be more complicated than yes or no. By the laws of single combat, yes. By any measure of justice or wisdom, no. Ulfar's scarred hands clasped together, the knuckles showing white with tension. Thorkel had made a ruling that cost my clan valuable trade rights. I was younger then, more concerned with my reputation than with right or wrong. I challenged him publicly, knowing that his age and recent injury from a riding accident would give me an unfair advantage. But he could have refused the challenge. He could have. But doing so would have destroyed his standing among his people. I knew this when I issued the challenge. I counted on it. Ulfar's voice carried the weight of long-held shame. I forced an honorable man into a fight he could not win, then killed him for the crime of having been a better leader than I deserved to follow. Brynja stared at the twisted silver ring, trying to reconcile this tale of calculated cruelty with the gentle giant who had helped her find her courage. What happened afterward? Thorkel's son demanded justice, as was his right. But instead of accepting the consequences of my actions, I fled like a coward. I took ship to distant lands and spent 5 years learning the hard way that running from your crimes doesn't make you free, it just makes you a different kind of prisoner. The silence that followed felt charged with all the weight of confession and judgment. Brynja found herself studying Ulfar's face, searching for signs of the man he described, the proud, cruel warrior who would kill for convenience and flee from consequences. But all she could see was the pain of someone who had spent years living with the knowledge of who he used to be. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked finally. "Because Thorkel's son sent word 3 days ago. He has tracked me here and rides with a small party of his father's loyal men. They will arrive within the week, and when they do, I will have to face the justice I ran from 5 years ago." The revelation struck her like a plunge into icy water. "You're leaving?" "I don't know. That depends on whether Bjorn Torkelson wants satisfaction in blood or settlement in silver. Either way, our time together may be ending before it has truly begun." Brynja felt something fierce and protective rising in her chest. Not the helpless terror she had felt during Gunnar's rages, but the determined anger of someone whose happiness was being threatened by forces beyond her control. "So you thought you would tell me this story to make it easier for me when you're gone? You thought if I knew what kind of man you used to be, I would be less likely to mourn your loss?" "I thought," Ulfarr began, then stopped, clearly surprised by the heat in her voice. "You thought wrong." She reached across the table and picked up the damaged arm ring, turning it over in her hands as she spoke. "This ring tells me about a man who made terrible choices, driven by pride and anger. But it doesn't tell me anything about the man who spent 5 years learning from those choices, who came home to face consequences instead of running further, who chose to help a woman find her freedom instead of taking advantage of her vulnerability." She set the ring down with deliberate care. "I'm not the naive girl I was when I married Gunnar. I know that good men can do terrible things, and that terrible men can sometimes learn to choose goodness. What matters to me is not who you were 5 years ago, but who you choose to be today. And if Bjorn demands my life as payment for his father's death, then I will mourn you as a woman mourns a man she was learning to love," Brynja said, the words surprising her with their honesty. "But I will not let you make that choice easier by pretending you are less than you have become." Ulfar's eye widened at her declaration, and for a moment she saw vulnerability so profound it made her heart ache. "You would love a killer? A coward who ran from his crimes?" I would love a man who learned that strength without honor is just another kind of weakness. I would love a man who chose to come home and face the consequences of his actions rather than spend his life running from them. She reached across the table and covered his clenched hands with her own. I would love a man brave enough to confess his worst moment to a woman whose opinion of him matters. For the first time since she had known him, Ulfarr looked as if he might weep. Instead, he turned his hands palm up beneath hers, their fingers intertwining, like the roots of two trees sharing the same soil. Then I will try to be worthy of such love, he said quietly, for whatever time we have left. The days that followed Ulfar's confession moved with the relentless certainty of an approaching storm. Word of Bjorn Thorkelson's approach had spread through Vargstead like ripples across still water, bringing with it the kind of tension that made conversations halt when Ulfarr entered a room and resume in hushed whispers after he left. Brynja found herself caught between admiration for the community that had accepted her transformation and frustration with their quick judgment of a man they barely knew. The same people who had defended her right to choose her own path now watched Ulfarr with the wary eyes of those already mentally preparing for his funeral. On the fourth day after his confession, she made a decision that would have been impossible during her years of mourning. She sought out Erik Gunnarsson, the level-headed brother who had helped diffuse Magnus's confrontation. She found him in the settlement's council hall, reviewing trade agreements by the light of several oil lamps. The building was smaller than the Great Hall, but carried an authority that came from being the place where important decisions were made. Maps covered one wall, showing trade routes and territorial boundaries that meant the difference between prosperity and hardship. Erik, she said, settling onto the bench across from his work table, I need to speak with you about Ulfar's situation. The young man, though he was nearly her own age, his serious demeanor made him seem older, looked up from his documents with the careful expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation. I wondered when you would come, he said, setting aside his quill. You care for him, I do, more than I expected to care for anyone again. She kept her voice steady, though her heart raced with the implications of this admission. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I think the settlement is making a mistake. How so? You're all acting as if his fate is already decided, as if there's nothing to be done but wait for Bjorn to arrive and demand blood. But Ulfarr is one of us now. He's returned home and contributed to our community. Doesn't that earn him some consideration? Erik leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What are you proposing? That we don't simply hand him over like a criminal? That we meet with Bjorn as a community and hear what terms might satisfy justice without requiring death? And if Bjorn demands blood satisfaction, if nothing less than Ulfar's life will settle the debt? Brynja had been asking herself the same question for days, and the answer had crystallized into something that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. Then we tell him that to take Ulfar's life, he'll have to take it from people who value him. We make it clear that harming him would create new debts rather than settling old ones. You're talking about protection, possibly armed protection. Erik's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications. That could lead to bloodshed that goes far beyond one man's crimes, or it could lead to negotiation, to a settlement that serves justice without requiring vengeance. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. Erik, in the years you've known me, have I ever asked for anything? Have I ever used my position or my loss to demand special consideration? No, you've been a model of dignity and proper behavior. Then trust me now when I tell you that Ulfarr is worth defending. Not because I care for him, but because he represents something this community needs, the possibility that people can change, that mistakes can be atoned for through better choices. Erik was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the maps on the wall as if seeking guidance from the carefully drawn boundaries and trade routes. There is precedent, he said finally. When Harald the Red killed Olaf Longbeard 20 years ago, the Jarls negotiated a settlement that satisfied honor without requiring blood. What kind of settlement? Payment in silver and service. Harald gave Olaf's family enough wealth to maintain their standing and swore an oath of protection that bound his descendants to theirs for 3 generations. Eric met her eyes. But that was different. Harald killed in fair combat during a declared feud. Ulfar's situation is more complicated because he fled afterward, because he fled, and because the manner of the challenge showed poor judgment at best, deliberate cruelty at worst. Eric's honesty was gentle but uncompromising. Bjorn has legal right to demand blood, and many would say moral right as well. Then we offer him something better than blood, Brynja said, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Something that serves his father's memory more completely than simple vengeance. Before Eric could ask what she meant, the hall's door swung open to admit Ulfarr himself. He moved with the careful control of someone trying not to show how much weight he carried on his shoulders. But Brynja had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotional state. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his eye moving between them with concern. "But I wanted to speak with Eric about arrangements for when Bjorn arrives." "What kind of arrangements?" Eric asked. "I'll meet with him privately, away from the settlement. Whatever satisfaction he requires, there's no need for the community to witness it or be involved in the consequences." "No." The word came from Brynja with such force that both men stared at her. "Absolutely not. You're not going to sneak away like a criminal and face this alone. Brynja, we were just discussing the possibility of community intervention," Eric said, his tone carefully neutral. "Lady Brynja believes the settlement should support you in seeking a negotiated resolution." Ulfar's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling into resignation. "That's generous but unrealistic. The law is clear, and I've had 5 years to consider every alternative. Bjorn wants justice for his father's death, and justice means my life." "Justice," Brynja said, rising from her seat with determination, "means making things as right as they can be made. Your death doesn't bring Thorkel back. It doesn't undo the harm you caused. But your life, lived in service to better principles, might accomplish something worthwhile. What are you thinking?" Eric asked, clearly recognizing that she had moved beyond theoretical discussion to practical planning. "I'm thinking that Bjorn Thorkelson lost more than a father when Ulfarr killed Thorkel. He lost the guidance and protection that came with having a wise leader. What if we could offer him something that serves that need?" Both men waited for her to continue, and Brynja felt the weight of their attention as she voiced the plan that had been forming in her mind. What if Ulfarr swore an oath of protection and service to Bjorn's family, not as a slave or thrall, but as a sworn guardian whose life becomes forfeit if he fails in his duty to protect what Thorkel can no longer protect? The silence that followed felt charged with possibility. Eric was the first to speak. "It has precedent. And it would give Bjorn something more valuable than revenge, security for his family's future. It would also mean leaving Vargstead," Ulfarr said quietly. "Living among people who would always see me as their patriarch's killer." "Not necessarily," Brynja replied, her heart racing as the full implications of her plan became clear. "What if Bjorn's family came here? What if the oath included bringing them into our community under Ulfar's protection?" "You're talking about a significant expansion of our population," Eric warned. "New families mean new resources needed, new dynamics to manage. New families also mean new strength, new skills, new possibilities for trade and alliance." Brynja looked between the two men, seeing opportunity where they saw complications. "We've been talking about growing the settlement. This could be the beginning of that growth." Ulfarr shook his head slowly. "It's an ambitious plan, but it assumes Bjorn would be willing to consider alternatives to blood satisfaction. He may not be. Then we make sure he understands the alternatives clearly," Brynja said, with a determination that surprised her. "We show him that his father's death can lead to something constructive rather than just another death." As she spoke, she realized that somewhere in the past weeks she had stopped thinking of herself as a woman who watched life happen to her and started thinking of herself as someone who could shape events through her choices. The transformation felt as profound as the removal of her morning torcs, and twice as terrifying. Bjorn Torkelson arrived on a morning when the snow fell so heavily it seemed to muffle the very sound of the world breathing. Brynja watched from the great hall's windows as the small party of riders emerged from the white curtain like figures from a dream or a nightmare. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in their postures, the way their hands rested near weapon hilts despite the peaceful nature of their approach. Bjorn himself was younger than she had expected, perhaps no more than 25 winters, with the kind of lean strength that came from hard work rather than warfare. But it was the woman riding beside him that made Brynja's breath catch, clearly his wife, heavy with child and looking as if the difficult journey had taxed her beyond endurance. He brought his pregnant wife through winter travel to witness vengeance, Astrid observed from beside her, disapproval thick in her voice. Either he's a fool, or this matter means more to him than simple blood satisfaction. The settlement's leadership had gathered in the great hall to receive the visitors formally. Eric stood at the center, flanked by the other senior men, while Ulfarr waited to one side with the calm dignity of someone who had made peace with whatever judgment awaited him. Only Brynja seemed unable to find stillness, her hands clasping and unclasping as she watched the drama unfold. The great doors opened to admit the party, and immediately the hall's atmosphere shifted. Bjorn Torkelson entered with the bearing of a man carrying a burden too heavy for his years, his eyes scanning the assembled faces until they found Ulfarr. But instead of the rage Brynja had expected to see, his expression held something more complex. Pain, certainly, but also what looked like relief. Ulfarr Grimson, Bjorn said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. I have traveled far to find you. I am here, Ulfarr replied simply. I will not run again. Good, because there are questions that need answers, and I have carried them too long. Eric stepped forward with the formal bearing of a host receiving guests. Bjorn Torkelson, you and your companions are welcome in our hall. Come, warm yourselves by our fire, and we will speak of what brings you so far in winter's depths. But Bjorn held up a hand, his attention still fixed on Ulfarr. Before I accept hospitality, before I speak of terms or settlements, I need to know something. When you killed my father, did you take anything else from his body? Anything besides the arm ring you claimed as prize? The question seemed to catch Ulfarr off guard. I took only what was traditional. The ring as proof of victory, nothing more. Then where is it? Bjorn's voice cracked with emotion he had clearly been holding back. Where is my father's seal? The carving that proved his authority as Jarl that should have passed to me upon his death. Silence fell over the hall like a physical weight. Brynja could see confusion flickering across Ulfar's face, followed quickly by understanding that seemed to drain the color from his features. What seal? Ulfarr asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to guess at terrible possibilities. The walrus ivory seal carved with his personal runes. He wore it always on a leather cord around his neck. When we found his body, it was gone. Bjorn's young wife had moved to stand beside him, her hand resting on her swollen belly as if protecting their unborn child from the implications of this conversation. Without it, I cannot prove my legitimacy as his heir. Our enemies have used its absence to challenge my right to lead, to steal lands that belong to my family for generations. The weight of this revelation settled over the hall like ash from a burned building. Brynja felt sick as she understood what Bjorn was truly saying, that Thorkel's death had been about more than one man's pride, that consequences had rippled out to destroy a family's entire future. I swear to you, Ulfarr said, his voice thick with horror, I took no seal. I barely looked at his body after it was over. I claimed the arm ring because tradition demanded it, but I touched nothing else. Then who? Bjorn demanded, though his anger seemed directed more at circumstances than at Ulfarr himself. Who else was there? Who else had access to my father's body before we arrived? The seconds, Eric said quietly. In formal combat, there are always seconds present to witness and ensure fairness. Who served as your second? Bjorn asked Ulfarr. Ragnar Ironside, Magnus and Gunnar's eldest brother. The name fell into the all silence like a stone into deep water. Brynja felt the world shifting around her as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. Ragnar had been present at her wedding to Gunnar, had been the one to suggest the massive dowry that had elevated her family's status. He had also been notably absent from Gunnar's funeral, claiming urgent business in distant settlements. Where is Ragnar now? Bjorn asked, though his question was clearly directed at the settlement's leadership rather than Ulfarr. He left Vargstead 2 years ago, Eric replied carefully. There were irregularities in some of his trading arrangements. He departed before the matter could be fully investigated. Irregularities, Astrid snorted from her place near the fire. The man was caught selling false weights and watered ale. He fled like the thief he was. Understanding crashed over Brynja like a cold wave. He used Thorkel's seal to legitimize fraudulent trades. That's how he built the wealth that convinced my father to accept Gunnar's marriage proposal. The implications hung in the air between them, reframing everything they thought they knew about the past 5 years. Ulfarr had not simply killed a man and fled. He had been the unwitting tool in a larger theft that had destroyed a family and corrupted the foundation of Brynja's own marriage. If this is true, Bjorn said slowly, then my father's death was not the crime, the theft of his seal was. And Ulfarr was no more guilty of that than I am. But I still killed him, Ulfarr said, his voice hollow with the weight of recognition. I still chose pride over wisdom, still forced an honorable man into unfair combat. Yes, but you didn't rob him. You didn't steal his authority and use it to defraud others. Bjorn looked around the hall, his gaze thoughtful. The crime I came to avenge was not my father's death in honest combat, but the theft that left our family vulnerable to our enemies. Brynja felt something shifting in her chest, a mixture of relief and renewed anger. Relief that Ulfar's crime was not as complex as they had believed, but anger that her own marriage had been built on stolen authority, that her years of suffering had been purchased with another family's birthright. What do you want from us? Eric asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a leader trying to navigate suddenly changed circumstances. I want to find Ragnar Ironside, Bjorn replied without hesitation. I want to recover my father's seal and reclaim what was stolen from my family. And he looked directly at Ulfarr. I want the man who killed my father to help me do it. The request hung in the air like a challenge and an opportunity combined. Brynja could see the surprise in Ulfar's face, followed quickly by something that looked like hope. You would trust me to help you? Ulfarr asked. My father was a wise man, but he was also proud. He accepted your challenge when he could have refused it because he believed in meeting strength with strength. I think, Bjorn paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. I think he would understand that honor sometimes requires working with former enemies to achieve justice. And if we find Ragnar, if we recover the seal, then my father's death becomes what it should have been from the beginning, a matter settled between warriors in fair combat. The blood debt dies with him, and whatever friendship we build in pursuit of justice becomes the foundation for our future relationship. Brynja felt tears she hadn't expected burning behind her eyes. Here was justice that looked forward rather than backward, that sought to build rather than destroy. It was the kind of wisdom she was still learning to hope for in her own life. There's one more thing, Bjorn's wife spoke for the first time, her voice soft but carrying clearly across the hall. Our child will be born soon. Too soon for more traveling. If you will have us, we would like to stay here until spring, when the baby is strong enough for the journey. Of course, Eric replied immediately. Any family seeking justice is welcome in our settlement. As the formal tensions of the confrontation dissolved into practical discussions of housing and provisions, Brynja found herself looking at Ulfarr with new eyes. The man who had helped her find her freedom was about to begin his own journey toward redemption, not through death or exile, but through the harder path of making amends by serving justice, and she intended to be part of that journey, whatever it might cost. The discovery of Ragnar's theft had transformed everything. But it also created new challenges that tested both the settlement's resolve and the fragile alliance between former enemies. In the 3 days since Bjorn's revelation, Vargstead had become a hub of careful planning and tense preparation, as they organized what amounted to a hunt for a man who had proven himself skilled at disappearing. Brynja found herself in the unexpected position of being central to their strategy. Her knowledge of Ragnar's habits and connections, gained through her marriage to Gunnar, provided insights that could mean the difference between success and failure. But accessing those memories meant revisiting parts of her past she had worked hard to leave behind. She sat now in the council hall, surrounded by maps and documents that Erik had gathered from various sources. Bjorn studied a trade route chart, while Ulfarr examined reports from settlements that might have harbored the fugitive. The atmosphere was focused but civilized, a far cry from the blood-soaked confrontation everyone had expected. "Tell us about Ragnar's allies," Bjorn said, looking up from his charts. "Who would shelter him? Who benefited from his fraudulent trades?" Brynja closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember conversations she had overheard during the tense years of her marriage. There was a merchant in Hedeby named Sven the Fat. Ragnar spoke of him often, said Sven could move goods through channels that avoided traditional oversight. If Ragnar needed to convert stolen authority into portable wealth, Sven would be the man to help. Hedeby, Ulfarr mused, tracing the route on the map with one scarred finger. 3 days hard riding in good weather. In winter, a week minimum, Erik finished. And that's assuming the mountain passes are clear. They won't be, Bjorn said with the certainty of someone who had traveled winter roads recently. But there's another problem. Even if we find Ragnar, proving he stole the seal won't be simple. He's had years to create false documentation, to build stories that support his possession of it. Unless, Brynja said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke, we don't try to prove theft. What if we approach this differently? The 3 men looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. She had been more involved in their planning than was typical for women in such matters, but her knowledge of the key players made her participation essential. "What are you thinking?" Ulfarr asked, his voice carrying the patience he had learned to show when she was working through complex problems. "Ragnar is proud. Cunning, yes, but proud above all else. He won't be able to resist the opportunity to gloat if he believes he's safe." She stood and moved to the map, pointing to a settlement marked halfway between Vargstead and Hedeby. "Ironwood. It's neutral territory, used for winter markets when travel to larger towns becomes impossible." "I know Ironwood," Bjorn said. "Small settlement, but they host fair-sized gatherings during the lean months." "Why is that important?" "Because Ragnar will be there. He never could resist a captive audience for his stories of successful trades. And if we approach him correctly—" She paused, the full implications of her plan becoming clear. "If I approach him correctly, he might confess to the theft without realizing what he's admitting." "Absolutely not," Ulfarr said immediately, his voice carrying an edge of protective anger. "You're not going anywhere near that man." The risk of what? That he'll recognize me?" Brynja turned to face him, feeling the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through every major decision since removing the morning torc. "Ulfarr, I spent 3 years married to his brother. I know how Ragnar thinks, how he reacts to different approaches. That knowledge makes me the best choice for drawing him into admissions. It also makes you a target if he realizes what you're trying to do," Erik pointed out, though his tone suggested he was considering the merits of her proposal, rather than dismissing it. "Then we make sure he doesn't realize it until—" "It's too late." Brynja moved to another map that showed Ironwood's layout in detail. The winter market operates out of a large hall, similar to ours, but designed for temporary use. Lots of people, lots of noise, lots of opportunities for private conversations that aren't actually private. Bjorn leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "You're talking about a performance, making him believe you're there for innocent reasons while getting him to incriminate himself in front of witnesses." "Exactly." Ragnar always saw me as Gunnar's simple wife, decorative but not particularly intelligent. If I approach him as a widow seeking advice about managing my late husband's affairs, he'll see an opportunity to demonstrate his superior wisdom, and in demonstrating that wisdom, he might reveal knowledge he shouldn't possess, Ulfarr said, understanding dawning in his expression. Knowledge about Thorkel's seal and how it might be used to authenticate valuable transactions. It's risky, Eric warned. If something goes wrong, if he becomes suspicious, then we have 3 seasoned warriors nearby to ensure my safety, Brynja replied, looking directly at Ulfarr. I'm not proposing to face him alone. I'm proposing to use advantages we possess, my knowledge of his character, your skills at remaining unnoticed when necessary, and Bjorn's legal authority to arrest him once we have sufficient evidence. The room fell silent as each man considered the implications of her plan. It was bold, requiring precise timing and considerable risk, but it also offered the possibility of resolving their problem without the violence that typically accompanied such pursuits. There's one more advantage, Brynja continued, pulling a small object from her sleeve. It was the carved pine piece that Einar had completed the previous day, 2 trees growing close enough to share strength while maintaining their individual shapes. Ragnar will see this and assume I've moved on from mourning. He'll want to hear details about my transformation, especially if he thinks those details might include information about inheritance or available wealth. You would use his greed against him, Bjorn observed, appreciation evident in his voice. I would use every tool available to achieve justice for your family and peace for mine, she replied firmly. Ragnar's theft didn't just rob you of your birthright. It corrupted the foundation of my marriage, made me part of a fraud I knew nothing about. I have as much right to see him face consequences as you do. Ulfarr was quiet for a long moment, his eye studying the maps and documents as if seeking alternatives that didn't require risking the woman he cared for. If we do this, he said finally, if we attempt such a plan, you follow my lead regarding safety. At the first sign of danger, I defer to your judgment, Brynja agreed, understanding the compromise he was offering. But Ulfarr, you need to trust that I can handle myself in a conversation. I've spent years learning to read dangerous men and respond appropriately. The winter market begins in 4 days, Eric said, consulting a calendar marked with various regional observances. If Ragnar is going to be there, he'll arrive early to establish the best trading position. Then we leave tomorrow, Bjorn decided, early enough to arrive ahead of him, to scout the location and prepare our approach. What about your wife? Brynja asked, concerned about the practical aspects of their plan. She shouldn't be traveling in her condition, but leaving her here, Astrid has already offered to attend her during the birth, Bjorn replied, his expression softening at mention of his spouse. And several of the settlement's women have volunteered to help with preparations. She'll be safer here than she would be traveling with us. As the meeting moved toward practical preparations, supplies needed, routes to take, contingency plans for various scenarios, Brynja found herself looking at the carved pine piece in her hands. When Einar had created it, she had been thinking about growth and partnership. Now it would serve as bait in a trap designed to catch a thief. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same object that represented her hope for the future would help them confront the corruption of her past. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps real growth required facing the lies that had shaped previous choices, exposing them to light so that truth could take root in cleaner soil. Are you certain about this? Ulfarr asked, as the others began gathering maps and documents. His voice carried concern that went beyond tactical considerations. I'm certain that running from problems doesn't solve them, she replied, thinking of his own 5-year exile and what it had cost him. I'm certain that some fights are worth having, especially when the alternative is letting injustice continue unopposed. And if confronting Ragnar changes how you feel about your marriage to Gunnar, if learning the full extent of the deception makes the past even more painful. Brynja considered this, understanding that he was asking about more than just her emotional well-being. He was asking whether she could face the truth about her past and still be open to building a different kind of future. "Then I'll deal with that pain honestly, instead of carrying it in ignorance," she said. "I've learned that truth, however difficult, is easier to bear than beautiful lies." As they prepared to leave Vargstead on what amounted to a quest for justice, Brynja realized that somewhere in the process of planning this confrontation, she had stopped thinking of herself as someone who needed protection and started thinking of herself as someone capable of providing it. The transformation felt as significant as any she had experienced since removing the morning torc. Tomorrow they would begin a journey that would test everything they had built together. But tonight she felt ready for that test in a way she could never have imagined. Just weeks before, the winter market at Ironwood buzzed with the controlled chaos that came when isolated. Communities gathered to trade goods and gossip. Brynja moved through the crowded hall with the careful grace of someone who belonged but wasn't particularly important. Exactly the impression she wanted to create as she searched for her target. 2 days of patient observation had confirmed their suspicions. Ragnar Ironside had indeed come to Ironwood, and he had come wealthy. His booth displayed goods that spoke of successful trading: fine furs, worked metal, and jewelry that caught the light with the gleam of genuine precious stones. But it was the way he handled his transactions that told the real story. Each major sale was accompanied by the production of a carved seal that he pressed into wax to authenticate the exchange. The seal that, by rights, should have been buried with Thorkel the Wise 5 years ago. "He's using it openly," Ulfarr had observed the previous evening as they reviewed their reconnaissance. "Either he's grown careless with success, or he believes he's beyond the reach of consequences." "Probably both," Bjorn had replied grimly, "which makes him dangerous if he realizes we're here now." As Brynja approached Ragnar's trading area, she felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that had carried her through every significant challenge since removing her morning torcs. The carved pine pendant rested against her throat, visible enough to invite questions, meaningful enough to provide conversation, innocent enough to seem like simple jewelry rather than bait. "Ragnar Ironside," she called out as she reached his booth, her voice carrying just the right mixture of surprise and delight. "I thought that was you across the hall." The man who turned to greet her had aged in the 2 years since leaving Vargstead, but not gracefully. His face showed the soft corruption that came from easy wealth and easier morals, and his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone always looking for advantage. "Brynja, by Thor's hammer, what brings Gunnar's widow to a winter market? Surely you have people to handle such mundane affairs." His greeting carried false warmth, wrapped around genuine curiosity. "I'm learning to handle them myself," she replied, allowing a note of uncertainty to creep into her voice. "These past months have taught me that depending entirely on others leaves a woman vulnerable to poor advice." Wise words. "Though I'm surprised to see you without your morning jewelry. Have you decided to rejoin the living at last?" His gaze fixed on the pine pendant with exactly the interest she had hoped for. "This is beautiful work. New, I'd guess." "A recent commission. I felt it was time to mark the end of my mourning period properly." She touched the pendant with apparent unconscious gesture. "Though I confess, I'm uncertain about many aspects of moving forward. Gunnar left affairs more complicated than I expected." "Complicated how?" Ragnar's merchant instincts were clearly engaged now, sensing opportunity in her apparent confusion. "Legal matters mostly. Documents that need proper authentication, inheritance questions that require official seals." She sighed with practiced frustration. "I never realized how difficult it could be to prove legitimacy when dealing with distant traders who don't know our family." "Authentication can indeed be challenging," Ragnar agreed, his hand unconsciously moving toward the pouch where she knew he kept Thorkel's seal. "The right documentation makes all the difference in serious transactions." "I don't suppose—" She hesitated, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "You've always been skilled at navigating such complexities. Might you have advice about securing proper authentication for significant sales?" "What sort of sales?" The greed in his voice was barely disguised now. Gunnar acquired several pieces of unusual value during his later years. Ember work from the eastern routes, silver from northern mines. Beautiful pieces, but without proper provenance, difficult to sell for their true worth. She could see him calculating, weighing the possibilities of profit against the effort required to help her. Provenance can be arranged, given the right connections and the proper authority to legitimize transactions. What sort of authority? She asked, letting hope creep into her voice. Official seals, for one thing. Documents bearing the marks of recognized jarls can transform uncertain goods into unquestionable value. He was warming to his subject now, pride in his own cleverness overriding caution. I have access to such authentication acquired through perfectly legitimate channels. Really? That's remarkable. I wouldn't have thought such things were available to private traders. Most aren't. But I have connections that go back years. Relationships built on mutual benefit and discretion. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing valuable secrets. For instance, I possess a seal that once belonged to Thorkel the Wise himself. Acquired it during the settlement of his estate after that unfortunate business with Ulfarr Grimson. Brynja felt her heart racing, but kept her expression carefully neutral. Thorkel the Wise? I remember hearing about his death. Wasn't there some question about missing items from his personal effects? Rumors, nothing more. His son was young, inexperienced in such matters. Easy enough for valuable items to be overlooked during the chaos following sudden death. Ragnar's smile held the satisfaction of someone who believed himself. Cleverly vague rather than incriminating. And this seal, it's still effective for authentication. More than effective. Thorkel's reputation for honesty means his mark carries exceptional weight in trading circles. I've used it to legitimize transactions that might otherwise have faced unnecessary scrutiny. The confession hung in the air between them, and Brynja felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Too much enthusiasm would seem suspicious, but too little might cause him to reconsider what he had already revealed. That's remarkably resourceful, she said finally. Though I imagine such valuable authentication tools require careful handling. Indeed they do. Would you like to see it? I find that demonstrating the quality of my resources often reassures potential partners. As Ragnar reached for his pouch, Brynja caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of her vision, Ulfarr positioning himself where he could intervene if needed, while Bjorn moved to block the booth's rear exit. The trap was closing, but the most dangerous moment was yet to come. Ragnar's hand emerged from his pouch, holding a piece of carved walrus ivory that seemed to glow with inner light in the hall's flickering torchlight. Even from her position across the trading table, Brynja could see the intricate runes that marked it as a seal of genuine authority. But more than that, she could see the way Ragnar held it, with the possessive pride of someone who had convinced himself that theft was merely clever acquisition. Beautiful work, isn't it? He said, turning the seal so the carved surface caught more light. Thorkel had it made by the finest craftsman in his territory. See how the ivory has been polished to perfection, how the runes are cut deep enough to leave clear impressions. This is the mark of a man who understood that authority must be visibly authentic. May I? Brynja extended her hand with the innocent curiosity of someone examining an interesting piece of craftsmanship. Careful with it, Ragnar said, though he placed the seal in her palm with the confidence of someone who believed himself completely safe. Such pieces are irreplaceable once lost. The ivory felt warm from Ragnar's handling, and Brynja could see why Thorkel's mark carried such weight in trading circles. The carving was indeed masterful, but more than that, it carried the accumulated trust of years of honest dealing. As her fingers traced the carved runes, she felt a deep sadness for all the ways this single object had been perverted from its original purpose. The craftsmanship is remarkable, she agreed, then looked up with carefully calculated uncertainty. But tell me, how does one ensure that using such authentication doesn't create legal complications? Surely Thorkel's heir would have concerns about his father's mark being used without authorization. Ragnar's expression flickered just for a moment, with something that might have been unease. But pride quickly reasserted itself. Bjorn Torkelson is a boy trying to play at being a jarl. He lacks his father's wisdom and authority. Besides, what he doesn't know can't hurt legitimate business arrangements. Still, Brynja pressed gently, wouldn't it be safer to have some documentation showing how you came to possess such an important seal? Some record of legitimate transfer? Documentation can be flexible when one knows the right people to provide it. Ragnar's smile held the cold satisfaction of someone who believed himself above consequences. The beauty of working with Thorkel's mark is that his reputation was so unassailable that few questioned transactions bearing his seal. It's like borrowing the trust he spent a lifetime building. Borrowing, repeated a new voice from behind Ragnar, causing the merchant to spin around with startled alarm. Bjorn Torkelson stood at the edge of the trading booth, his young face carrying an expression of controlled fury that made him look far older than his years. Behind him, Ulfar's imposing presence blocked any hope of retreat. While around them other merchants and traders had begun to notice the sudden tension. That's an interesting word choice, Bjorn continued, his voice carrying clearly across the immediate area. I prefer stealing myself. It seems more accurate for a man who robs the dead. Ragnar's face went through several rapid changes: surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally a desperate attempt at indignation. Bjorn, what brings you so far from your father's lands? Surely you have more pressing concerns than winter trading. I do indeed. I have the pressing concern of recovering property stolen from my father's body after his death. Bjorn's gaze fixed on the seal still resting in Brynja's palm. Property that should have passed to me as his rightful heir. I don't know what you think you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts witnessed by everyone within hearing. Bjorn gestured to the growing crowd of traders who had abandoned their own business to watch this unexpected drama unfold. You have just confessed to possessing my father's personal seal, to using it without authorization, and to creating false documentation to support fraudulent transactions. Ragnar's eyes darted between the faces surrounding him, clearly recognizing that his situation had become precarious. This is a misunderstanding. I acquired the seal through legitimate channels during the settlement of your father's estate. From whom? Ulfarr asked, his voice cutting through Ragnar's protests like a blade through silk. I was present at Thorkel's death. I can testify that he wore the seal when the combat began, and that you were the only person to approach his body before his family arrived. You! Ragnar's face twisted with recognition and rage. Ulfarr Grimson, you have no right to speak of legitimacy, you who fled like a coward after murdering a better man. Perhaps not, Ulfarr agreed calmly. But I have the right to confess my own crimes honestly, which is more than you seem capable of doing. Brynja stepped forward, the seal still resting in her open palm like evidence in a formal trial. Master Ragnar, you told me yourself that you acquired this seal during the settlement of his estate, and that you've used it to legitimize transactions that might otherwise have faced unnecessary scrutiny. The entire hall heard your words. Words can be misinterpreted. Not when they're spoken before so many witnesses. Eric's voice cut in as he emerged from the crowd. Brynja felt a surge of gratitude as she realized he must have followed them from Vargstead to provide additional legal authority to their confrontation. Eric, Goodnerson speaks truth, called out one of the local merchants. We all heard what was said. Clear as day it was. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering crowd, and Brynja could see the moment when Ragnar realized that his words had indeed trapped him beyond any hope of denial or escape. I invoke the right of recovery, Bjorn announced formally. This seal was stolen from my father's body, and I claim it in his name and my own. Ragnar's hand moved toward his belt, but Ulfar's shifted stance made it clear that violence would be both futile and costly. Instead, the thief's shoulders sagged with defeat. The seal, Brynja said gently, closing her fingers around the carved ivory. Justice demands its return to rightful hands. As she placed the recovered artifact in Bjorn's waiting palm, she felt a weight lifting that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The weight of having been unknowingly part of a fraud, of having lived a lie built on another family's loss. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating in a way that reminded her of the moment Ulfarr had removed her mourning torc. Some chains, she realized, could only be broken by facing the truth about how they had been forged. Spring arrived early that year, as if the winter had grown tired of holding the land in its grip and was eager to see what new growth might emerge from soil that had been frozen too long. Brynja stood in the doorway of her quarters, watching the settlement come alive with the energy that always accompanied the season's first warm days. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at Ironwood, and the changes those months had brought felt as profound as the transformation from winter to spring. Ragnar now labored in Eric's grain fields, working to repay the debts his fraud had created, a fitting punishment that served justice while providing value to the community. More importantly, Bjorn's family had indeed decided to make Vargstead their permanent home, bringing with them skills and connections that had already begun strengthening the settlement's prospects. But the most significant change was the one Brynja felt within herself. The woman who had spent 3 years watching life from the shadows had become someone who stepped into sunlight with confidence, who made decisions based on hope rather than fear, who had learned to trust her own judgment about what was worth fighting for. Lost in contemplation again? Astrid's voice carried gentle amusement as the old woman approached, carrying a basket of early spring herbs. Counting blessings, Brynja replied, stepping aside to let her pass. It seems important to notice them when they arrive. Indeed it does. And speaking of arrivals, Astrid's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of someone delivering welcome news. Einar has finished his latest commission. He's quite pleased with how it turned out. The carved wedding gift had been Brynja's idea, created in secret over the long winter months, as she and Ulfar's relationship had deepened into something that felt both inevitable and miraculous. 2 pine trees, roots intertwined, but crowns growing toward different aspects of the same sky, a symbol of partnership that preserved individual strength while creating shared foundation. "Is he ready for visitors?" she asked, though her feet were already carrying her toward the workshop. "He's been ready since dawn. That man loves few things more than showing off his finest work." The workshop buzzed with spring activity as craftsmen emerged from winter's enforced idleness to begin new projects. But Einar's corner held a focused quiet as the old carver put finishing touches on what would be his masterpiece. The wedding chest stood 3 feet high and nearly as wide, crafted from timber that had been aged to perfect hardness and polished to a warm gleam. But it was the carving that took Brynja's breath away. The intertwined pines covered the entire front panel, their roots forming an intricate pattern that spoke of strength shared and support given. Above them, the tree crowns reached toward carved clouds that suggested endless possibilities. "It's magnificent," she whispered, running her fingers along the detailed bark texture that made the wooden trees seem alive. "It should be," Einar replied with satisfaction. "It's intended to hold the treasures of a remarkable partnership. The woman who commissioned it deserves craftsmanship that matches her courage, and the man who will share it deserves a woman wise enough to see that true strength sometimes wears the face of gentleness." The workshop door opened to admit the subject of their conversation. Ulfarr ducked slightly to clear the frame, his massive presence somehow managing to seem both powerful and careful in the space filled with delicate tools and half-finished projects. "Good morning," he said, his eye moving from the wedding chest to Brynja's face with an expression that held wonder and gratitude in equal measure. "Einar, you have outdone yourself." "I had exceptional inspiration," the craftsman replied, beginning to gather his tools. "And now I believe I'll find urgent business elsewhere, leaving you two to discuss whatever plans this chest might represent." After he left, silence settled over the workshop like morning mist. Brynja and Ulfarr stood on opposite sides of the wedding chest, each understanding that the moment had arrived for decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. "It's beautiful," Ulfarr said finally. "Almost too beautiful for someone like me, someone like you." Brynja moved around the chest to stand closer to him. "You mean someone who learned that real courage means choosing compassion over conquest? Someone who helped a trapped woman find her freedom? Someone who faced his past mistakes honestly and worked to make amends? Someone who killed a good man because pride mattered more than wisdom? Someone who spent 5 years learning from that mistake and returned home to face justice rather than run from it?" She reached up to touch the scar that marked where his left eye had been, her fingers gentle against the evidence of old violence. "Ulfarr, I need you to understand something. The man who challenged Thorkel 5 years ago isn't the man standing before me now. People change. People grow. And the man you've become is worthy of any happiness life might offer. Even worthy of you. Especially worthy of me. Because I'm not the same woman who wore that silver torc for 3 years. Who watched life happen from shadows. Who let fear make her choices." She smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle into her bones like warmth from a well-tended fire. "We're both different people than we were when our story began. The question is whether the people we've become want to build a future together." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Whatever that future holds, whatever challenges we face, I want to meet them as your partner, as your equal. As someone who chooses you freely and hopes to be chosen in return. Then we should probably discuss practical matters," she said, though her heart was singing with joy. "Like when to hold the ceremony, who to invite, where we'll live." "I have thoughts about that last one," Ulfarr replied, his expression growing serious. "I know this settlement has been your home for years, but I wonder if you might consider something different. What did you have in mind?" Bjorn's family brought word of new settlements forming to the east, places where people with fresh ideas about partnership and community are building something unprecedented, places where a woman's voice carries equal weight in decisions, where strength is measured by what you build rather than what you destroy. The possibility he described resonated through her like struck crystal, a place where the lessons they had learned could flourish, where their partnership could serve as foundation for community rather than exception to tradition. "It would mean leaving everything familiar," she said, though the idea excited rather than frightened her. "Together," he replied simply. "We would leave everything familiar together and build something new together." As spring sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, illuminating the wedding chest that would carry their treasures into whatever future they chose to create. Brynja felt the last chains of her past dissolving into possibility. Some journeys, she realized, required leaving behind not just what had harmed you, but what had merely been safe. "Yes," she said, reaching for his hands and feeling their strength welcome her own. "Let's build something new, outside." The settlement continued its ancient rhythms, but within the workshop. Two people who had learned to choose freedom over fear, growth over stagnation, and partnership over isolation, began planning a future that would honor both their individual strength and their shared dreams. The silver morning torc lay buried somewhere beneath winter's melted snow, but what had grown in its place was far more valuable. The understanding that true love didn't bind or possess, but freed both people to become their best selves. And in that freedom, they had found not just happiness, but the foundation for a life worth building together.